Picture this. A crowded field in rural Michigan, hundreds of people in costumes, music pounding. Through the darkness, and somewhere in that chaos, a young woman vanishes without a trace. No phone. No purse. No goodbye. Just gone. On the night of October 25, 2014, 22-year-old Chelsea Bruck attended a Halloween party that would become the last place anyone saw her alive. What happened to her that night would baffle investigators, torment her family, and eventually shock an entire community when the truth finally came to light. This is the story of a cold case that refused to stay cold, a disappearance that turned into a homicide, and an arrest that revealed just how dangerous a single night can become. For 6 months, Chelsea's fate remained a mystery. Then a construction worker made a grim discovery that would set in motion a chain of events leading straight to a factory worker named Daniel Clay, a man whose story would change multiple times before a jury decided his fate. What really happened to Chelsea Bruck on that Halloween night? The answer is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Let me introduce you to Chelsea Bruck. 22 years old, living at home with her parents in Monroe County, Michigan. Those who knew her best described Chelsea as shy, kind, and deeply responsible. She wasn't the type to make impulsive decisions or vanish without telling anyone where she was going. She was thoughtful, conscientious, and incredibly close to her family. Chelsea worked a local job and maintained the kind of routine that grounded her life. She loved spending time with friends, but she was never reckless. Her mother, Leandra, knew her daughter's habits, her patterns, her ways. Chelsea wasn't someone who would simply disappear. That's what made what happened on Halloween 2014 so immediately terrifying. For the Halloween party that year, Chelsea had been excited. She'd put together a homemade costume, Poison Ivy, the iconic Batman villain. The costume was distinctive, memorable. Green and leafy, it would make her stand out in a crowd. She'd worked on it carefully, proud of how it turned out. Friends remember her enthusiasm about wearing it, about going to the party, about having a fun night out. Chelsea's personality didn't match the party scene she was about to enter. This wasn't a small gathering. This was a massive outdoor event in Frenchtown Township, hosted on private property, with hundreds of attendees. The kind of party where chaos reigns, where the music is deafening, where people are drinking heavily, where costumes and masks make everyone anonymous. The kind of party where it's easy to lose track of someone. But Chelsea went with friends. She had people looking out for her. Or so everyone thought. She arrived at the party wearing her Poison Ivy costume, ready for a night of harmless fun. Her phone was charged. Her purse was with her. She had everything she needed to stay connected, to stay safe, to get home when the night was over. The last confirmed sighting of Chelsea Bruck alive was in the early morning hours of October 26th. She was seen walking away from the main party area, alone. Friends who had come with her lost track of her in the massive crowd. In a gathering of hundreds of people, all in costumes, all moving through darkness and noise, Chelsea simply vanished. When dawn broke and Chelsea's friends realized she hadn't made it home, the panic set in immediately. This wasn't like her. She would have called, she would have texted, she would have let someone know where she was. But her phone went straight to voicemail. Her parents hadn't heard from her. No one had any idea where Chelsea Bruck had gone. What her loved ones didn't know yet was that Chelsea would never make it home. Somewhere between the party and safety, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The morning of October 26, 2014, should have been filled with hangover stories and laughter about the previous night's party. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare that would consume Chelsea Bruck's family and the entire Monroe County community. When Chelsea's friends realized she was missing, they immediately started making calls. They contacted her parents. They reached out to other partygoers. They retraced their steps from the night before, trying to remember the last time they'd seen her. The answers were fragmented, confused, filtered through alcohol and the chaos of a massive Halloween bash. Someone remembered seeing Chelsea talking to a man. Or maybe it was two men. The details were fuzzy. Another person thought they saw her near vehicle. But in the darkness, with everyone in costume, identification was nearly impossible. The party had been so crowded, so chaotic that pinpointing exact movements, interactions was like trying to reconstruct a dream from scattered images. Chelsea's parents contacted the Monroe County Sheriff's Office immediately. This wasn't a case of a young woman sleeping off too much partying at a friend's house. Chelsea's phone was off her dead. Her purse, which contained her identification and other essential items, was never found. Most telling of all, Chelsea herself had simply evaporated into the night. The first alarm that sounded for investigators was the completeness of her disappearance. She hadn't contacted anyone. She hadn't used her phone. She hadn't accessed her bank accounts. She hadn't shown up for work. For someone as responsible and connected as Chelsea, this silence was deafening. police immediately descended on the party site. The property was massive open fields surrounded by woods in rural Frenchtown Township. Officers, volunteers, and search and rescue teams began combing through the area. They searched fields. They searched tree lines. They searched drainage ditches and outbuildings. They brought in cadaver dogs. They interviewed anyone and everyone who had attended the party. The most baffling detail investigators faced was the sheer number of potential witnesses. Hundreds of people had been at this party, yet no one could provide a clear, definitive account of what happened to Chelsea Bruck. Costumes had disguised faces. Alcohol had impaired memories. Darkness had obscured details. It was an investigator's nightmare, a crime scene with hundreds of people present, yet virtually no usable information. Detectives started building a timeline. Chelsea had arrived at the party with friends around 9 or 10 p.m. on October 25th. She'd been seen intermittently throughout the night, dancing, socializing, drinking. But sometime in the early morning hours of October 26th, she became separated from her group. That separation would prove fatal. Witness statements began trickling in, but they were maddeningly vague. Someone thought they saw Chelsea near the parking area. Another person remembered a woman in a green costume talking to a man by a pickup truck. But was it definitely Chelsea? Was the man someone she knew? Was the interaction friendly or coerced? No one could say with certainty. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the immediate party site. Police checked local hospitals, thinking perhaps Chelsea had been injured and taken for treatment. They checked with taxi services and rideshare drivers. They reviewed surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and convenience stores. Nothing. Chelsea Bruck had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a growing sense of dread. Days turned into weeks. The searches continued. Chelsea's family organized vigils, distributed missing person flyers, and maintained constant contact with investigators. Her mother, Leandra, became the public face of the search, pleading with anyone who had information to come forward. She wore purple, Chelsea's favorite color, to every interview, every press conference, every vigil. The community rallied. Volunteers joined. Searches. Social media campaigns spread Chelsea's photo far and wide. Tips poured into the sheriff's office, hundreds of them. Each one had to be investigated, verified, pursued. Most led nowhere. Some were well-intentioned but ultimately useless. Others were outright lies that would complicate the investigation in ways no one anticipated. What investigators didn't know at this point was that Chelsea Bruck was already dead. Her body was lying in a remote location approximately 10 miles from the party site, hidden in an area where no one had thought to search. And the person responsible for putting her there was someone who had attended the same party, someone who had interacted with Chelsea, someone who had already been interviewed by police and had lied directly to their faces. The clock was ticking on this case. With each passing day, evidence degraded, memories faded, and the trail grew colder. But Chelsea's family refused to give up hope. They couldn't know that the answer to what happened to their daughter was already buried in the investigative file, waiting to be uncovered. Detective work in missing person cases follows a brutal timeline. The first 40 to 8 hours are critical. After that, the chances of finding someone alive drop dramatically. By the time Chelsea Bruck had been missing for a week, investigators knew that we're likely looking at something far worse than a voluntary disappearance. Lead Detective Jason Bailey of the Monroe County Sheriff's Office took charge of the case. Bailey had experience with complex investigations, but this one presented unique challenges. The crime scene, if there even was one, was a massive outdoor party site that had been trampled by hundreds of people. Any physical evidence that might have existed had been destroyed or contaminated beyond usability. Bailey's team started with the basics: victimology. Who was Chelsea Bruck? What were her habits, her relationships, her routine? They interviewed her family, her friends, her co-workers. Everyone painted the same picture: irresponsible, thoughtful young woman who would never voluntarily disappear without contact. That consistency was telling. It meant foul play was increasingly likely. The investigative team then focused on the party itself. Who had organized it? Who had attended? Who had interacted with Chelsea? This is where the case became exponentially more complicated. The party had been advertised on social media, drawing people from multiple counties. There was no guest list, no registration, no way to definitively identify everyone who had been present. Detectives began the painstaking process of tracking down partygoers through social media posts, photos, and word of mouth. They conducted hundreds of interviews. Most people remembered very little. Those who did remember seeing Chelsea could only provide vague descriptions of interactions. A man in a costume, maybe a pickup truck, possibly near the parking area. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Early leads emerged, and then dissolved like smoke. Someone reported seeing a woman matching Chelsea's description, walking along a rural road miles from the party site. Officers investigated and found nothing. Another tip suggested Chelsea had been seen getting into a vehicle with Michigan license plates. That description fit thousands of vehicles in the area. Then came the false confessions. And this is where the case took a dark, frustrating turn that would waste valuable investigative resources and delay justice. In December of 2014, a woman named Jessica Churchill came forward with a shocking claim. She told police that her boyfriend had confessed to killing Chelsea Bruck. The boyfriend was arrested. The case seemed to break wide open. But then investigators discovered the truth. Churchill had completely fabricated the story. Her boyfriend had nothing to do with Chelsea's disappearance. Churchill was arrested and charged with filing a false police report and obstruction of justice. This false accusation wasn't just a waste of time, it was devastating. It diverted resources away from legitimate leads. It gave Chelsea's family false hope that the case was solved. It damaged public trust in the investigation. And it demonstrated just how much misinformation and deception was swirling around this cold case. But the false confession from Churchill wasn't an isolated incident. Multiple people contacted police, claiming to have information about Chelsea's disappearance, only for investigators to discover they were lying, seeking attention, or trying to implicate people they had personal grudges against. Each false lead had to be investigated thoroughly, consuming time and manpower. Detective Bailey and his team pressed forward, despite the frustration. They analyzed Chelsea's phone records, looking for any unusual contacts or patterns. They reviewed her social media accounts, searching for potential threats or concerning interactions. They investigated every romantic relationship she'd had, every casual acquaintance, every person who might have had reason to harm her. One investigative avenue that showed promise was witness identification of vehicles at the party. Several people remembered seeing Chelsea near a pickup truck. Detectives compiled a list of attendees who drove pickup trucks and began tracking them down for interviews. This is where Daniel Clay's name first appeared in the investigative file. Daniel Clay was a local factory worker in his late 20s with a history of arrests, though nothing that immediately flagged him as a violent predator. He'd attended the Halloween party. He drove a pickup truck. And when detectives interviewed him in the early days of the investigation, he admitted to having a brief interaction with Chelsea Bruck. Clay's initial statement to police was simple, almost dismissive. Yes, he'd talked to Chelsea at the party. She'd asked him for a ride home. He'd declined because he didn't know her and had other plans. She'd walked away, and that was the last he saw of her. It seemed like a reasonable explanation. At the time, investigators had no reason to doubt it. Clay was noted in the file and set aside as detectives pursued other leads, but his name would come back to haunt the investigation later. For now, though, the case was stalling. No body, no crime scene, no definitive suspect. Just a missing young woman and hundreds of dead-end leads. By early 2015, the case was essentially cold. Active searches had been suspended. The investigative team had pursued every viable lead and come up empty. Chelsea's family continued to advocate for renewed attention, but without new evidence there was little police could do. The community mourned. Missing person posters featuring Chelsea's face remained on bulletin boards and storefront windows throughout Monroe County. Her mother wore purple and spoke to anyone who would listen about her daughter. Vigils were held. Prayers were offered, but Chelsea Bruck remained missing, and the question of what happened to her seemed destined to become one of Michigan's enduring mysteries. Then, in April of 2015, everything changed. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about what it means when a case goes cold. It's not that investigators give up. It's not that the family stops caring. It's that every lead has been exhausted, every witness has been interviewed, every piece of evidence has been analyzed, and there's simply nowhere left to go. For the Bruck family, those months between October 2014 and April 2015 were a special kind of torture. They lived in a state of suspended grief. Chelsea was missing, but without a body, there was no closure, no funeral, no definitive end. Just an agonizing unknown that consumed every waking moment. Leandra Bruck, Chelsea's mother, became a fierce advocate for her daughter. She refused to let the case fade from public consciousness. She gave interviews to local media. She organized community events to keep Chelsea's name in circulation. She maintained pressure on law enforcement to keep the case active, even as leads dried up and the investigation ground to a halt. The emotional toll on the family was immeasurable. Holidays came and went without Chelsea. Her birthday passed. Every milestone became a reminder of her absence. The Bruck family kept Chelsea's room exactly as she'd left it, a shrine, to hope that somehow, impossibly, she might still come home. But deep down, they knew. When weeks turn into months without any contact, without any sign of life, the terrible truth becomes inescapable. Chelsea wasn't coming home. She hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life somewhere else. Something awful had happened to her on that Halloween night, and whoever was responsible had successfully hidden the evidence. Meanwhile, in the community, rumors proliferated. Small towns don't handle mysteries well. People speculated. They gossiped. They pointed fingers. Some believed Chelsea had been the victim of a serial killer. Others thought she'd been abducted by someone passing through the area. Still others whispered about local people, about suspicions and theories that had no basis in fact but spread like wildfire nonetheless. Detective Bailey and his team never truly abandoned the case, even as it officially went cold. Cold doesn't mean forgotten, it means waiting. Waiting for new technology, waiting for someone to talk, waiting for that one crucial piece of evidence that can revive an investigation and bring it roaring back to life. In cold cases, time can be both an enemy and an ally. It's an enemy because evidence degrades, witnesses' memories fade, and suspects can flee or die before justice is served. But it's an ally because guilt has a way of eating at people. Relationships fall apart, and former partners start talking. People who were once loyal become willing to cooperate. Consciences develop cracks, and sometimes, purely by chance, someone stumbles across something that changes everything. For Chelsea Bruck's case, that someone was a construction worker doing routine site preparation for a new development project. The property was in Township, about 10 miles from the original party site where Chelsea had last been seen. It was rural, isolated, surrounded by woods and farmland, the kind of place where you could hide something or someone and be confident it would never be found. Until it was. April 24, 2015. Nearly 6 months after Chelsea Bruck's disappearance, a construction worker was surveying land for a development project in Township when he noticed something unusual partially buried in the ground. At first, he thought it might be a large rock or piece of debris, but as he got closer, the shape became more defined, more recognizable, more horrifying. It was a human skull. The worker immediately contacted authorities. Monroe County Sheriff's deputies arrived on scene within minutes. What they found confirmed their worst fears. This was not an isolated bone or ancient remains. This was a crime scene, and very likely they had just found Chelsea Bruck. The area was immediately cordoned off. Forensic teams were called in. The painstaking process of recovering and documenting evidence began. Over the next several hours, investigators discovered more skeletal remains scattered across a small area. The body had been there for months, exposed to the elements, to wildlife, to decomposition, but crucially, there was enough left to tell a story. Among the remains, investigators found torn fabric pieces of green material that matched Chelsea's distinctive poison ivy costume. That fabric became the key to identification, even before dental records could be confirmed. This wasn't just any human remains. This was Chelsea Bruck, and the location of her body 10 miles from the party site immediately told investigators that this was a deliberate disposal, not an accident, or a case of someone wandering off and succumbing to the elements. The medical examiner was brought in to analyze the remains. Even with the advanced decomposition, certain things were immediately apparent. The skull showed significant trauma. The pattern of the remains suggested the body had been placed, not buried, and left to decompose naturally. There were no signs of any attempt to deeply conceal the remains. No grave had been dug, no effort had been made to hide the body beyond choosing a remote location. This told investigators something crucial about the perpetrator. Whoever had killed Chelsea and left her body here had acted impulsively, not with careful planning. The disposal site suggested panic, haste, and a desperate attempt to get rid of evidence without thinking through the long-term consequences. This wasn't a serial killer's carefully chosen dump site. This was someone who'd made a terrible decision and then tried to cover it up in the quickest way possible. News of the discovery spread rapidly. Chelsea's family was notified before the information went public. For Leandra Bruck, the news brought a collision of emotions, grief that her worst fears were confirmed, but also grim determination that now, finally, there might be justice. A body meant evidence. Evidence meant investigation. Investigation meant the possibility of identifying and prosecuting whoever had done this. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office immediately reactivated the case as a homicide investigation. The cold case was suddenly white-hot. Every piece of evidence from the original missing person investigation was reviewed with fresh eyes. Every witness statement was reanalyzed. Every person of interest was reevaluated. Detective Bailey and his team knew that the discovery of Chelsea's body was their best chance, possibly their only chance to solve this case. The body itself was evidence. The location was evidence. The torn costume was evidence. The trauma to the skull was evidence. All of it pointed toward a violent encounter, a killing, and a cover-up. The forensic analysis began immediately. The medical examiner conducted a thorough examination of the skeletal remains. Despite the decomposition, certain injuries were unmistakable. Chelsea's skull showed severe blunt force trauma. Her facial bones were broken. Her teeth were damaged. The injuries were extensive, violent, and clearly the cause of death. This wasn't a case of accidental death. This wasn't someone who'd overdosed or fallen or wandered into the woods and died of exposure. This was a homicide. Chelsea Bruck had been struck in the head with tremendous force, repeatedly, causing catastrophic injuries that would have been immediately fatal or left her unconscious and dying. The condition of her costume told another part of the story. The fabric was torn at the straps and at the crotch. The tearing pattern suggested forcible removal or a violent struggle. This added a sexual component to the crime that investigators had suspected but couldn't confirm without physical evidence. Now they had that evidence, and with it came a renewed focus on the original witness statements and persons of interest from the Halloween party. Detectives began methodically working through the list of men who had interacted with Chelsea, men who had been seen near her, men who drove vehicles that matched witness descriptions. Daniel Clay's name came back up. His original statement to police had been brief and seemingly innocuous. But now investigators looked at it with suspicion. He'd admitted to talking with Chelsea. He'd admitted she'd asked him for a ride. He'd claimed he'd declined, and that was the end of their interaction. But what if that wasn't the end? What if he'd changed his mind? What if something had happened after that initial encounter? Detectives decided it was time to have another conversation with Daniel Clay. This time, the interview would be very different. With Chelsea Bruck's remains recovered and identified, the investigation shifted from a missing person case to a homicide. The stakes were higher, the urgency was renewed, and Detective Bailey and his team had a clear mission: identify, kill Chelsea Bruck, and build a prosecutable case against them. The first step was revisiting every person of interest from the original investigation. Hundreds of people had been interviewed in the weeks after Chelsea's disappearance. Now, 6 months later, with a body and a confirmed homicide, those same people needed to be re-interviewed. Memories might have changed. Guilt might have loosened tongues. Someone might be willing to talk now who wasn't willing before. Investigators also had new leverage. They could tell witnesses that this was a murder investigation. That simple fact changes conversations. People who might have been unwilling to snitch about something relatively minor become much more cooperative when they learn someone was killed. The social calculus changes. The moral imperative shifts. Daniel Clay was brought in for a follow-up interview. This time, the tone was different. Detectives weren't asking general questions about the party. They were focused, specific, and armed with information Clay didn't know they had. Clay's story began to shift. In his first interview, he'd said Chelsea asked for a ride, and he declined. Now, he acknowledged that maybe he'd talked to her a bit longer than he initially said. Maybe they'd walked toward the parking area together. Details that had been omitted from his first statement suddenly started appearing. Detectives pressed harder. They pointed out inconsistencies. They challenged his timeline. They made it clear they knew more than they were revealing. And slowly, Daniel Clay's account of that night began to change in significant ways. But Clay wasn't confessing. He was adjusting his story, adding details, but maintaining that he'd done nothing wrong. He admitted to more interaction with Chelsea than he'd originally disclosed, but he stopped short of admitting to anything criminal. It was a classic suspect behavior: provide just enough truth to explain away evidence, but not enough to incriminate yourself. Detectives knew they needed more. They needed forensic evidence linking Clay directly to Chelsea's death. They needed witnesses who could place Clay and Chelsea together beyond what he was admitting. They needed to break his story down completely and expose it as the lie they believed it to be. The investigation expanded to include Clay's background. What they found was concerning. Daniel Clay had a criminal history. His arrests were mostly for relatively minor offenses, but they painted a picture of someone comfortable operating outside the law. He'd been arrested for receiving stolen property, for driving offenses, for various misdemeanors. That suggested a pattern of poor decision-making and disregard for rules. More importantly, investigators began talking to people who knew Clay personally. They interviewed co-workers from the factory where he was employed. They talked to friends, acquaintances, family members. They were looking for any indication that Clay had a history of violence, particularly violence against women. What emerged wasn't a clear pattern of violent crime, but rather a portrait of someone who was impulsive, aggressive, and willing to bend the truth when it served his interests. Multiple people described Clay as someone with a temper, someone who could be charming, but also intimidating, someone who liked to project an image of toughness. Investigators also focused on Clay's vehicle, the pickup truck he'd been driving the night of the party. They obtained a search warrant and conducted a thorough forensic examination. They were looking for any trace of Chelsea Bruck: hair, blood, fibers from her costume, DNA, anything that would definitively place her in that vehicle. The forensic results came back with limited findings. Given the 6-month gap between the crime and the vehicle examination, This wasn't entirely surprising. Vehicles are difficult to preserve as crime scenes, especially when the owner continues using them. Clay had presumably cleaned the vehicle multiple times in the intervening months, but investigators did find some fiber evidence that was consistent with Chelsea's costume, though not definitively conclusive. What investigators really needed was a confession or a witness who could directly contradict Clay's story, and then they got a break from an unexpected source, Daniel Clay's own mouth. While Clay was being held on an unrelated matter, he was recorded talking to his girlfriend during jail calls. Those calls are routinely monitored and recorded, a fact that most inmates intellectually understand but emotionally ignore. People in jail get lonely, scared, and desperate to talk to loved ones, and they often say things they absolutely should not say. In one of those recorded conversations, Daniel Clay made statements about Chelsea Bruck that went far beyond what he told police. He told his girlfriend that yes, he'd given Chelsea a ride, yes, things had happened between them, and yes, she died, but it was an accident, not murder. This was the breakthrough investigators needed. Clay had just admitted on a recorded line to having far more involvement in Chelsea's death than he'd ever acknowledged to police. The recordings were immediately added to the evidence file. Prosecutors reviewed them and determined they had enough to charge Daniel Clay with murder. On October 21, 2015, nearly a year after Chelsea Bruck's disappearance, Daniel Clay was arrested and charged with open murder. Open murder in Michigan means the prosecution doesn't have to specify in advance whether they'll pursue first-degree or second-degree murder charges. They can present evidence and let the jury decide the appropriate level of conviction based on what's proven at trial. The arrest made headlines throughout Michigan. For Chelsea's family, it was a moment of bittersweet relief. They would never get their daughter back, but finally someone was being held accountable. Finally, there would be answers. Finally, there would be justice. The community reaction was one of shock. Daniel Clay wasn't a stranger. He was a local man, someone people recognized, someone who'd been living among them for the entire year Chelsea had been missing. He'd gone to work every day, gone about his life, all while knowing exactly what had happened to Chelsea Bruck and where her body was lying. As the prosecution prepared for trial, they faced a significant challenge. Despite the recorded jail calls, despite Clay's shifting statements, they still didn't have a complete picture of exactly what happened on that Halloween night. What they did have was physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, and Clay's own contradictory statements. The question was whether it would be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. The medical examiner's report became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Dr. Kilakesha conducted the autopsy and examination of Chelsea's remains, and his findings were damning. Chelsea had died from severe blunt force trauma to the head. Her injuries included multiple broken facial bones, a fractured skull, and several chipped or broken teeth. The severity of the injuries was crucial. These weren't the kind of injuries you get from a simple fall or even from a single punch. These were the injuries of a sustained, violent attack. Someone had struck Chelsea in the face, and had multiple times with significant force. The pattern suggested either multiple blows with a fist or object, or a combination of beating and her head being struck against something hard, possibly the interior of a vehicle. The torn costume added another layer to the story. The poison ivy outfit had been ripped at the straps and at the crotch. The ripping pattern was forcible, not the kind of tearing that happened from normal wear or even from a consensual sexual encounter. It suggested violence, struggle, and lack of consent. Prosecutors assembled their theory of the crime based on the physical evidence, the witness statements, and Clay's own admissions. They believed the following had occurred. Chelsea Bruck, after becoming separated from her friends at the party, encountered Daniel Clay. Clay, who'd been drinking and was attracted to Chelsea, offered her a ride home. Chelsea, who was also intoxicated and needed a way to leave the party, accepted. They left together in Clay's pickup truck. At some point during the drive, or after pulling over somewhere, Clay made sexual advances. Whether Chelsea initially consented to any sexual contact, or whether Clay forced himself on her immediately was unclear, but at some point, the situation became violent. Clay attacked Chelsea, tearing her costume, and striking her repeatedly in the face and head. The attack was brutal and sustained. Chelsea's facial bones were broken. Her teeth were damaged. Her skull was fractured. She would have lost consciousness quickly and died either immediately or shortly after from the catastrophic head trauma. Clay, realizing what he'd done, panicked. He drove to the remote location in Township where Chelsea's body was eventually found, and he disposed of her remains. He didn't bury her deeply or attempt to conceal the body with any sophistication. He simply left her there and drove away, hoping she'd never be found, or that if she was, there'd be no way to connect her death to him. Then Clay went home, cleaned up, and began the process of constructing a lie that would last nearly a year. This theory explained all the physical evidence. It explained Chelsea's disappearance. It explained the location of her body. It explained the injuries. And it explained why Clay's story kept changing. He was trying to stay just ahead of what investigators could prove, admitting only to what he absolutely had to acknowledge while minimizing his culpability. But then Daniel Clay did something that both helped and hurt his case simultaneously. He decided to testify at trial and offer his own version of events. His story was shocking, disturbing, and designed to explain the physical evidence while claiming the death was accidental. Clay testified that yes, he'd picked up Chelsea. Yes, they'd had a sexual encounter, but it was consensual, he claimed. Chelsea had wanted to engage in what he termed freaky sex. Specifically, he claimed Chelsea had asked him to choke her during the sexual encounter. And according to Clay, he'd complied. He'd choked Chelsea, and she'd lost consciousness. When he realized she'd stopped breathing, he panicked. And instead of calling for help, he disposed of her body. This defense, often called the rough sex defense, has a long and controversial history in criminal law. Essentially, defendants claim that a death that occurred during consensual sexual activity involving violence or choking was accidental, not intentional. The victim can't contradict the story because they're dead, which is precisely what makes this defense so morally repugnant and legally problematic. Prosecutors tore into Clay's testimony. They pointed to the extensive facial injuries, the broken bones, the chipped teeth, the fractured skull. Are those injuries consistent with choking? No. Those are injuries from being beaten in the face. Those are injuries from blunt force trauma, from fists, or an object striking Chelsea's face repeatedly. The prosecution argued that Clay's rough sex gone wrong story was a desperate attempt to explain away evidence of a violent homicide. If Chelsea had simply lost consciousness from being choked, why would her face be shattered? Why would her teeth be broken? Why would her skull be fractured? The torn costume also contradicted Clay's story. If this was a consensual encounter, why was the costume ripped forcibly? Why was it torn at the crotch in a manner consistent with sexual assault? Nothing about the physical evidence supported the story Daniel Clay was telling. Prosecutors also emphasized Clay's behavior after Chelsea's death. If this had truly been an accident, why didn't he call for help? Why didn't he attempt CPR? Why didn't he seek emergency medical assistance? Why did he dispose of her body in a remote location and then lie to police for months about his involvement? The answer, prosecutors argued, was simple. This wasn't an accident. This was a murder. Daniel Clay had attacked Chelsea Bruck, sexually assaulted her, beaten her until she was unconscious or dead, and then disposed of her body to avoid consequences. His story was a fabrication designed to evade responsibility for a brutal homicide. The prosecution's approach was to pursue first-degree felony murder. In Michigan, first-degree felony murder means that a killing occurred during the commission of another felony, such as kidnapping or criminal sexual conduct. The prosecution didn't have to prove that Clay specifically intended to kill Chelsea, only that he intended to commit a felony and that Chelsea died as a result. Given the physical evidence, this was a strategic charging decision. The torn costume, the sexual nature of the encounter, and the violence all supported charges of criminal sexual conduct. If Clay had forcibly assaulted Chelsea sexually, and if she died during that assault, that constituted first-degree felony murder under Michigan law. The defense fought hard against this theory. They maintained that the encounter was consensual, that the death was accidental, and that charging Clay with first-degree murder was an overreach. But they faced an uphill battle. The physical evidence told a story that contradicted everything Clay claimed. The arrest of Daniel Clay on October 21, 2015, was the culmination of nearly a year of investigation, heartbreak, and determination. When Monroe County Sheriff's deputies arrived to take Clay into custody, they did so knowing that this moment represented justice for Chelsea Bruck and closure for her family. Clay was arrested at his home. Officers executed the arrest warrant and transported him to the Monroe County Jail, where he was booked on charges of open murder and disinterring a body without authorization. That second charge, disinterring a body, related to Clay's disposal of Chelsea's remains and his failure to report her death to authorities. The news spread rapidly through the community. Local media covered the arrest extensively. Chelsea's missing person case had been high profile from the beginning, and the community had followed every development. Now finally there was an arrest. Finally someone was being held accountable. For Chelsea's family, the arrest was emotionally complex. Leandra Bruck issued a statement thanking law enforcement for their tireless work. She expressed relief that someone was being charged, but she also made clear that no arrest, no conviction, no sentence could ever bring Chelsea back. The victory's hollow because the loss was permanent. Community reaction was one of shock mixed with vindication. Many people had suspected that Chelsea's disappearance was the result of foul play. not an accident or voluntary disappearance. The arrest confirmed those suspicions, but the identity of the suspect, a local man who'd been living among them for the entire year Chelsea was missing, was disturbing. Daniel Clay had gone to work every day at the local factory. He'd interacted with neighbors, with friends, with family. He'd known exactly what happened to Chelsea Bruck, while her family was desperately searching for answers. He'd watched the news coverage, seen the missing person posters, observed the community vigils, all while keeping his secret. The case drew comparisons to other cold cases that had been solved. Through dogged investigative work and breakthroughs in forensic evidence or witness testimony, it demonstrated that even cases that seem unsolvable can be cracked when investigators refuse to give up and when new evidence or information comes to light. As Clay sat in jail awaiting trial, prosecutors began building their case. They had the medical examiner's report. They had the forensic evidence from Chelsea's remains and costume. They had Clay's inconsistent statements. They had the recorded jail calls. They had witness testimony placing Clay and Chelsea together. It was a strong case, but they knew the defense would fight hard. Clay's defense attorneys began their own preparation. They knew they had an extremely difficult case to defend. The physical evidence was damaging. Clay's own statements undermined his credibility, but they had one potential strategy: convince a jury that even if Clay was responsible for Chelsea's death, it wasn't intentional murder, but rather a tragic accident during consensual activity. This strategy was risky. It required Clay to testify, which would expose him to cross-examination. It required the jury to believe Clay's version of events despite significant contradictions with the physical evidence, and it required them to overcome the visceral reaction most people have to the rough sex defense, the sense that it's a convenient excuse that blames the victim for their own death. The stage was set for a trial that would determine Daniel Clay's fate and provide Chelsea Bruck's family with the answers they'd been seeking for nearly 2 years. The trial of Daniel Clay began in Monroe County Circuit Court, presided over by Judge Daniel White. The courtroom was packed with spectators, media, and most importantly Chelsea Bruck's family, who attended every day of the proceedings, determined to see justice served. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They began by humanizing Chelsea, calling witnesses who testified about her character, her personality, and her life before that Halloween night. They wanted the jury to see Chelsea not as a faceless victim, but as a real person with dreams, relationships, and a future that was stolen from her. Then they moved to the events of October 25th and 26th, 2014. They called witnesses who'd attended the Halloween party. Several testified to seeing Chelsea in her poison ivy costume. Some recalled seeing her talking to a man near a pickup truck. The testimony was fragmentary memories dulled by time and alcohol, but it established Chelsea's presence at the party and suggested interactions with people she didn't know well. The medical examiner, Dr. Keisha, took the stand and walked the jury through Chelsea's injuries in clinical detail. This testimony was difficult to hear, but it was essential. Keisha explained the severe blunt force trauma to Chelsea's head, the broken facial bones, the chipped teeth, the fractured skull. He testified that these injuries were consistent with a sustained beating, not with simple choking or accidental death. The prosecution introduced photographs and forensic evidence showing the extent of Chelsea's injuries. They showed the jury the torn poison ivy costume, explaining how the ripping pattern indicated forcible removal and violence. Every piece of physical evidence pointed toward the same conclusion: Chelsea Bruck had been violently attacked. Then came the recorded jail calls. The prosecution played excerpts of Daniel Clay's conversations with his girlfriend, in which he admitted to giving Chelsea a ride, admitted to sexual contact, and admitted that she died in his presence. The jury heard Clay's own voice describing events that completely contradicted his earlier statements to police. Investigators testified about the evolution of Clay's statements. They detailed how his story changed from denying any significant interaction with Chelsea to admitting a brief conversation, eventually acknowledging that she'd been in his vehicle and died. Each shift in his story demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an ongoing effort to minimize his culpability. The prosecution rested their case after days of testimony. They'd presented a comprehensive picture of a violent homicide, a cover-up, and a defendant whose own words convicted him. Now it was the defense's turn. Defense attorneys faced an enormous challenge. They couldn't deny that Chelsea died. They couldn't deny that Clay had disposed of her body. They couldn't deny the physical injuries, so they focused on intent. Their strategy was to argue that Chelsea's death was a terrible accident, not an intentional murder. Daniel Clay took the stand in his own defense, a decision that would prove crucial. His testimony was detailed and frankly disturbing. He described meeting Chelsea at the party, talking with her, offering her a ride. So far, his testimony aligned with the prosecution's theory, But then Clay claimed the encounter became consensual. He testified that Chelsea had expressed interest in sexual activity. He claimed they drove to a secluded area where they engaged in sexual contact, and then according to Clay, Chelsea asked him to choke her. Clay testified that he complied with this request. He put his hands around her neck and applied pressure. Chelsea lost consciousness. Clay claimed he thought she just passed out, but when he realized she wasn't breathing, he panicked. Instead of calling for help, he disposed of her body. The prosecution's cross-examination of Clay was brutal. They hammered on the inconsistencies. They pointed to the facial injuries. They asked Clay to explain how choking someone would result in a broken skull, fractured facial bones, and chipped teeth. Clay had no good answers. Prosecutors asked Clay why, if this was consensual and accidental, he didn't call 911. Why didn't he attempt CPR? Why didn't he seek help? Clay's responses were evasive and unconvincing. He said he panicked, that he was scared, that he wasn't thinking clearly. The prosecution asked about the torn costume. If the sex was consensual, why was Chelsea's costume ripped forcibly? Clay claimed it just happened during the encounter, but the prosecution noted the specific ripping pattern at the straps and crotch, suggested force and resistance, not passion. Perhaps most damaging was when prosecutors confronted Clay with his own changing statements. They walked through his initial denial, his gradual admissions, his eventual story of accidental death. They asked the jury to consider whether someone telling the truth would need to adjust their story multiple times as evidence accumulated. The defense called character witnesses who testified that Clay wasn't a violent person, that they'd never seen him act aggressively toward women. But on cross-examination, the prosecution elicited that Clay had a criminal history and a reputation for having a temper. Closing arguments summarized the competing narratives. The prosecution argued that the physical evidence told an undeniable story of violent homicide. Daniel Clay had attacked Chelsea Bruck, beaten her, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and then disposed of her body to avoid responsibility. His rough sex defense was a transparent lie contradicted by every piece of forensic evidence. The defense argued that while Clay's actions after Chelsea's death were reprehensible, they didn't prove murder. They claimed the death was accidental, the result of consensual activity gone tragically wrong. They asked the jury to consider that Clay's panic and poor decisions afterward didn't make him a murderer. The jury received instructions on the various charges they could consider: first-degree felony murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, or acquittal. They were told to consider whether the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Clay had committed a felony, specifically criminal sexual conduct, and that Chelsea had died during the commission of that felony. The jury deliberated for several hours. The courtroom waited tensely. Chelsea's family held hands, praying for justice. And then finally, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. When the jury filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Chelsea's family sat in the front row. Leandra Bruck, wearing purple, Chelsea's favorite color, as she had throughout the trial. Daniel Clay stood at the defense table, his face unreadable. The clerk read the verdict: guilty. Guilty of first-degree felony murder. The jury had rejected Daniel Clay's defense entirely. They had concluded that the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Clay had committed criminal sexual conduct against Chelsea Bruck, and that she died as a result. The physical evidence, the medical testimony, and Clay's own contradictory statements had convinced them that this was not an accident. This was a murder. The courtroom reaction was immediate. Chelsea's family members embraced, crying tears of relief and grief. Justice had been served, but it couldn't erase the loss. Nothing would bring Chelsea back, but at least her killer would be held accountable. For Daniel Clay, the conviction meant a mandatory sentence. First-degree felony murder in Michigan carries a mandatory penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no parole hearings, no second chances, no opportunity for release. Clay would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The sentencing hearing took place weeks later. This was the opportunity for Chelsea's family to address the court, to speak directly to Daniel Clay, and to have their pain acknowledged in the official record. Leandra Bruck gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. She spoke about Chelsea as a daughter, as a person, as someone whose life had value beyond the way it ended. She described the years of not knowing what happened, the agony of waiting, the devastation of finding Chelsea's remains. And then, in a moment that shocked many observers, Leandra told Daniel Clay that she forgave him. She explained that forgiveness didn't mean what he did was acceptable, and it didn't mean she wasn't devastated by the loss of her daughter. But she refused to carry hatred in her heart. She was wearing purple, Chelsea's favorite color, and a Crime Stoppers pin bearing Chelsea's photo. She wanted Clay to see Chelsea's face as she spoke. Her statement was powerful, graceful, and heartbreaking. It demonstrated a strength that few could imagine possessing. While she forgave Clay, she also made clear that she believed justice required him to spend the rest of his life in prison. Other family members also spoke. They described the impact of Chelsea's death on their lives, on their family, on their ability to trust and feel safe in the world. They talked about holidays without Chelsea, birthdays without her, milestones she'd never experienced. They spoke about the permanence of their loss. Judge White then addressed Daniel Clay directly. He noted the severity of the crime, the brutality of the attack, the callousness of disposing of Chelsea's body, and lying about it for months. He emphasized that Clay had shown no genuine remorse, only attempts at self-preservation. The judge imposed the mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Daniel Clay would never be a free man again. He would die in prison, decades from now, having spent the majority of his life behind bars for what he did on Halloween night, 2014. As Clay was led from the courtroom in shackles, Chelsea's family remained, processing what had just occurred. They'd been fighting for this moment for years. They'd endured unimaginable pain, uncertainty, and frustration, and now, finally, it was over. Justice had been served. But the hollowness of that victory was evident on every face in the courtroom. Chelsea Bruck was still dead. A conviction couldn't change that. A life sentence for Daniel Clay couldn't bring her back. All it could do was ensure that he would never harm anyone else and that Chelsea's death would be recognized for what it was, a murder, not an accident. The conviction of Daniel Clay in the murder of Chelsea Bruck resonated far beyond Monroe County, Michigan. The case touched on several critical issues that continue to challenge our criminal justice system and our society. First, the case stands as a powerful reminder that cold cases are never truly hopeless. Even when leads dry up, even when months or years pass without progress, the possibility of a breakthrough remains. In Chelsea's case, that breakthrough came from the discovery of her remains and from Daniel Clay's own inability to keep his story straight. The message to families of missing persons is clear: don't give up. Continue to advocate, continue to push for answers, continue to keep your loved one's name in the public consciousness. Leandra Bruck's tireless advocacy kept Chelsea's case alive in the public mind and ensured that when breaks in the case occurred, there was still momentum to pursue justice. Second, the case highlighted advances in forensic science and investigative techniques. Even though Chelsea's remains were discovered 6 months after her death, and even though significant decomposition had occurred, the medical examiner was still able to determine cause of death and document injuries that contradicted the defendant's story. Forensic evidence was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Third, the case brought renewed attention to the controversial rough sex defense and its use in criminal trials. This defense strategy, claiming that a death during consensual sexual activity involving violence was accidental, has been used in multiple cases, almost always by male defendants claiming female victims consented to violence that killed them. Critics argue that this defense is inherently victim-blaming and allow defendants to use their victim's inability to testify against them. The victim can't contradict the defendant's claims about what was consensual and what wasn't. Legal reform advocates have pushed for limitations on when and how this defense can be used, arguing that it perpetuates dangerous stereotypes and allows violent offenders to evade responsibility. In Chelsea's case, the jury saw through the defense. The physical evidence, the extensive facial trauma, the broken bones, the torn costume, told a story that contradicted Daniel Clay's claims of consensual activity. The verdict sent a message that juries won't automatically accept claims of consent when the evidence suggests violence and assault. Fourth, the case underscored the dangers that can lurk in social settings that seem fun and harmless. A Halloween party with hundreds of attendees, music, alcohol, and costume creates an environment where people can become vulnerable. When Chelsea became separated from her friends, she was left in a position where she had to trust a stranger for a ride home. That decision, made in a moment of need and perhaps impaired by alcohol, cost her life. This isn't to blame Chelsea in any way. The only person responsible for her death is Daniel Clay. But the case does serve as a sobering reminder about party safety, the buddy system, and the importance of having plans for getting home safely. It's a reminder that predators exist and that they often target people in vulnerable situations. Fifth, the case led to changes in how local law enforcement approaches large outdoor parties. The Halloween party where Chelsea disappeared was unsanctioned, held on private property, and attended by hundreds of people with no registration or security. After Chelsea's death, there were calls for stricter regulations on such events, for better oversight, and for safety measures to protect attendees. The case also provided hope to other families dealing with missing loved ones. When Chelsea's case was solved, families of other missing persons in Michigan and beyond reached out to investigators, asking them to take fresh, looks at cold cases. Chelsea's case demonstrated that even years later, justice was possible. The Crime Stoppers organization, which had been involved in publicizing Chelsea's case and soliciting tips, used the successful resolution as an example of how public cooperation with law enforcement can solve cases. The tips that came in during the investigation, while not all directly leading to Clay, helped investigators build a comprehensive picture of the party and identify persons of interest. For the community of Monroe County, the case was a trauma that took years to process. A young woman from their community had been murdered. The killer had lived among them for a year while they searched for answers. The trial forced them to confront the reality that violence can happen anywhere, perpetrated by anyone, often by people who seem ordinary. But the community also demonstrated resilience. They supported Chelsea's family. They attended vigils. They cooperated with investigators. And when the trial concluded, they honored Chelsea's memory by advocating for victims' rights and for continued attention to unsolved cases. The story of Chelsea Bruck is one of tragedy, perseverance, and ultimately justice. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her attended a party on Halloween night 2014 and never came home. For 6 agonizing months, her family didn't know what happened to her. When her remains were finally found, the investigation that followed demonstrated the dedication of law enforcement and the power of forensic evidence to tell truths that defendants try to hide. Daniel Clay will spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to Chelsea Bruck. He took her life in a moment of violence, and then tried to escape responsibility through lies, denial, and eventually, a defense strategy that blamed the victim for her own death. The jury saw through it. The evidence spoke for itself, and justice, though delayed, was ultimately served. But this story isn't just about one case. It's about the thousands of cold cases that remain unsolved across the United States. It's about the families who wait years for answers that may never come. It's about the investigators who refuse to give up, who continue to pursue leads and re-examine evidence long after a case has officially gone cold. Chelsea's case reminds us that no investigation is truly over until it's solved. New technology emerges, witnesses' circumstances change, and they become willing to talk. Forensic techniques improve. Evidence that seemed inconclusive years ago can be reanalyzed with new tools. And sometimes, perpetrators themselves make mistakes. They talk to the wrong person. They get caught on a recorded line. They can't keep their story straight. For families dealing with missing loved ones, Chelsea's case offers both hope and heartbreak. Hope that answers are possible even years later. Heartbreak because those answers often confirm the worst fears. But even painful truth is better than agonizing uncertainty. At least with truth comes the possibility of justice, of closure, of moving forward with grief instead of being frozen in not knowing. If you have information about any unsolved case, any missing person, any crime that hasn't been solved, come forward. Your information could be the piece investigators need to crack a case wide open. A detail that seems minor to you might be the crucial link that brings someone home or puts a killer behind bars. To Chelsea's family, particularly to her mother Leandra, who fought so hard for so long to find answers, your strength, your advocacy, and your grace in the face of unimaginable loss inspired a community and ensured that Chelsea's story ended with justice rather than an unsolved mystery. To Chelsea herself, a young woman whose life was stolen far too soon, your story has been told. Your killer has been held accountable. Your memory lives on not just in the hearts of those who loved you, but in the renewed commitment to solve cold cases and bring justice to victims and their families. This case stands as a testament that justice, though sometimes delayed, never forgets, that the truth, though it may take years to emerge, will eventually come to light, and that every victim deserves to have their story told, their death investigated, and their killer held accountable. Thank you for listening to this account of the Chelsea Bruck case. Remember that behind every cold case is a real person, a real family, and real pain. If you found this story compelling, consider supporting organizations that work to solve cold cases, that advocate for victims' rights, and that provide resources to families of the missing. Until next time, stay safe, look out for one another, and never forget that every unsolved case represents someone still waiting for the answer to the most painful question a family can ask. What happened to my loved one? This has been the story of Chelsea Bruck, a cold case that was solved, a community that was shocked, and a family that never gave up hope. May her memory be a blessing, and may her story inspire continued dedication to seeking justice for all victims.